Uh, I hope you can see us because I cannot see you. But I see there is a shadow, so we have a number of people here. So welcome. We're coming to the closing, to the almost closing of the Ideas Lab, or maybe the Ideas Lab format. There will, of course, be a formal closing and more discussions, and there will be more side events in the afternoon, as you know. The subject here is about who takes the torch in climate change, global climate change leadership. The Paris Agreement, which is the first global agreement encompassing all the parties agreed in Paris, has not been possible without US, Chinese, but also European leadership assisting. Now there is a change of administration, and the question is who will be leading, who will taking these discussions forward. The obvious candidate, one of the obvious candidates would be China. Another obvious candidate, or maybe not so obvious, but certainly a candidate, would be the European Union. And the topic of this Ideas Lab, as you know, is reconstructing the Union. And there was another lab already where we looked at how this EU Sustainable Development Strategy and decarbonization strategy actually could help in reconstructing, could become a pillar of European Union revival, if you want to call it that way. So, who will take the torch? That's the discussion, and I would like to focus on these questions, because climate change, as you all know, is a very broad area, and you can bring almost everything in the debate. But let's focus on these issues. Who could lead, or what kind of coalitions could we think about, which takes the climate change story further? Paris Agreement agreed on certain reductions, but of course we all know in order to meet the long-term targets there is still some stretch to go. We have the speakers, and I introduce them now from my left, so to the right. And first we have Enrico Giovannini, who is a professor in Rome, and he is a former minister of labor and social policies, and he has been the moderator of the lab on EU sustainable development and decarbonization strategy. Next to him is Myron Ebel, who is a director of the Center for Energy and Environment in the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and is the former head of the transition team on the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. Next to him is Teresa Ribera, who is the director of the French Institute ITRI, who has been instrumental in fostering and helping to come to life of the Paris Agreement, if I may say this from my perspective. And she has been, as a former State Secretary for Climate Change in Spain, she has been intimately into the negotiations, and I understand she has been spending, some late nights on taking this further. Certainly when she was head of the climate change office. I don't know whether the state secretaries always spend late nights, but I think you did some. Next to Teresa is Surya Sethi, who is a former principal advisor of power and energy in India, and he was, if I may say, he was sort of father, or at least part of the fathership of the Indian energy strategy and the energy planning, and he'd been a core negotiator for India for many, many years. And before that, he has spent almost 20 years in the US, being at the IFC, part of the World Bank Group, where he was a chief investment officer. Now, I would just like to start with Enrico to kick us off. The idea is that we have each of the discussion leaders have about 5 to 7 minutes making a few points. We will have some debate among each other, and then we discussing all among ourselves. I would like to ask you already now, and I keep repeating and reminding you, I tell you already, that we want to stick to short contributions, not co-speeches, and we would like to focus on questions, very concrete questions, so that we are not getting too far away from the subject of today. With this appeal, to your discipline, I give the floor to Enrico to kick off the discussions. Please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. At the CEPS, they like to make jokes about words, because talking about who carried the torch on climate change means that we are burning, and it's true, absolutely true. And actually, the point is not really who will continue to carry the torch, but who will use the torch of climate change to change its policies, its society, its economy, its systems. And from this point of view, I think that EU has a huge opportunity, but a huge interest in doing that. According to the estimates, over the last few years, temperature in Europe increased more than on what happened in the rest of the world. 1 centigrade on the average. In Europe, it was 1.5 centigrade. And the forecasts show that if there will be an increase by 2 centigrades in Europe, we will have a higher increase in temperature. And this will be very unevenly distributed in Europe, with a lot of problems in the southern countries, more than in the northern countries. There will be a big reshuffling of some activities. And coming from Italy, I can tell you that this year for the winter tourism industry was really a horrible year, because we almost didn't have snow in the Alps, from our side of the Alps. This is just a few examples of the fact that Europe has or should have a huge interest in keeping the policies and strengthening and speeding up the transition for its own interest, besides talking about the world interest. And I think that others will talk about this issue, because if you are not a good guy in this respective, beside the impact on your own, I think that in future this will affect also international relations, international trade, and so on and so forth. This is my personal viewpoint. Now, if you want to run the Olympics, you must be very ambitious, and you have to train yourself a lot, even to be selected to carry the torch. And so the question is Europe enough ambitious on this point? We know that in terms of trends and targets, we are in line with the targets set up at 2020, even slightly better. But we don't have yet a full strategy to meet the Paris Agreement in 2030 and even later on. And Italy, for example, endorsed the Paris Agreement in few days, but we don't have yet an energy strategy on how to do it. Very classical Italian approach to these kind of things. Now, in the previous panel, and I will like to spend the remaining minutes just to share with you some of the strong messages that were made during the panel, is that we are talking about radical transformation of our economy, of our society, not only because of climate change, and we really need to change the paradigm. Otherwise, sustainability, not only in environmental terms, but especially in economic and social terms, as well as institutional terms, will not be with us in future. We are already seeing the risks of social unsustainability, institutional unsustainability, and therefore there is a big demand, in my view, for a plan about the future. The communication made by the Commission on 22nd November on how to link European policies to the Sustainable Development Goals is not strong enough, in my view, and a lot of people shared this view. And of course, climate change is only one of the ingredients of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I think that, as we discussed, a lot of things are being done, and so there was some optimistic view about the possibility of managing this transition towards a new model of economy, reducing impact on the environment, and so on and so forth. While others think that this is not going to happen unless you have some radical changes. And it's quite interesting that even the business sector is quite divided on this topic. The fact that a very important international company like Unilever decided to leave Business Europe, which is the business association of European companies, because according to Unilever, Business Europe was not ambitious enough, was slowing down the transition, the discussion. I think that is a signal. And recently, the roundtable on sustainable development and business activities, led by Paul Polman and Mark Malloch-Brown, published a report signed by 35 very important CEOs around the world, just saying that this transition to sustainable development is a huge business opportunity and not simply a cost. I think that at the end of the day, and I stop here, depending on how you see this point, you can decide to try to send to future generations the cost of this adjustment, or try to accelerate the transition for the benefits not only of the future generation but also of the current generation. I think that these are really the key questions that, depending on the answers, can make Europe really the leader or one of the leaders, or a continent that will continue to ask where we want to go, and will try to copy some of other models around the world, but without really keeping the European dream, because believe it or not, also Europeans have a dream. And I think that Europeans have a dream to live in the best possible place, with the highest level of quality of life, and also link to future generations. It's not only the European dream, I think, but Europe is the only place where in the treaty, which is not a constitution, but is something that is close to a constitution, has the concept of sustainable development. The Article 3 of the treaty talks about the principles, the aims of the Union, and sustainable development is one of them. So I'm proud to be European because of the Article 3, and I think that Europe should really take not only the torch, but the dream to become the champion of sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrico. That I think the message was very clear, and we will be discussing this as we go. Now we're coming to the next speaker, Myron Ebel. Myron, the climate change at the UNFCCC treaty at the time, or the framework convention, was very much the agenda of the then Bush administration. The US was the first country to ratify the United Framework Convention. And I think also it's fair to say that the Paris Agreement framework was very much the doing the spirit of the then U.S. administration. That was, of course, the Obama administration. Now, what is going to happen, if that vacuum is left, if the U.S. is not going to lead? I'm assuming it might not be leading. Maybe there's a different notion of leadership which we might want to discuss. Myron, please.
Thank you, Christian. I want to thank the Center for European Policy Studies for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here. I've learned a lot from the sessions I've been to. I understand that there are some people attending who object to my being here. I would just say, you may think me a bad person, but also consider that you might find some useful information from me. Now, this session is about leadership on climate change, and I would just like to give you the perspective of one side of the debate in the United States. The fact is that responsible leadership is accountable leadership. And on climate policy, we have had unaccountable leadership since the very beginning. Every election that we've had, with two exceptions, the candidates have tried to avoid talking about climate policies and what they entail. There's a slight asterisk with 2000. Al Gore tried to avoid talking about the Kyoto Protocol, which he was largely responsible for negotiating. Yet the people in Appalachia found out, and he would have won the election if he had won either West Virginia or his own state of Tennessee, but he lost both of those states largely because of this issue. The other election where climate played a role was 2010. After the House passed cap-and-trade legislation and the Senate did not vote on it, the House went Republican, and 20-some Democratic seats changed hands as a result of the cap-and-trade issue, and that was the biggest single factor in turning the House of Representatives from Democratic to Republican. But President Obama didn't run on climate change in 2008. Yet he supported cap and trade. Then he lost in 2010 and said, I can do this all through executive action and through regulation. I don't need Congress. He didn't run on it in 2012, and yet as soon as the election was over, he said, this is the biggest issue of my second term, and that's what I'm going to focus on, and that resulted in the Paris Climate Treaty. Now, so there has been a disconnect between what elections have been about and what presidents and Congresses have done up until this election. This election is the first election in America where both sides had a clearly enunciated climate policy, and one side was Trump and the other side was Clinton. They were very clear. They had very little in common. And President Trump ran on the following. He said, I will withdraw from the Paris Climate Treaty. We will stop funding UN climate programs. We will get rid of the EPA's power plant rules for greenhouse gas emissions. We will undo all of President Obama's climate action plan, which affects every single department of the federal government. We will get rid of some other obstacles to energy production. And then the flip side of what he promised was we will take off the shackles, particularly on federal land and offshore areas that are inhibiting oil and gas production. Now, as you know, the shale revolution in the United States has made the United States the world's energy superpower. And this will accelerate under the Trump administration as he gets rid of the federal land and federal offshore obstacles to oil and gas production. So if you want to talk about leadership, I would say the United States is not going to be a leader in climate policy. It is going to be a leader in a very pro-energy global realignment because, first of all, we have huge supplies of natural gas. There are very strong forces working to develop LNG terminals and export more of that gas, which will make Europe much less dependent upon Russia. And secondly, our oil reserves are going to be exported in larger and larger quantities, which will reduce the power of OPEC and Saudi Arabia to manipulate global oil prices. So the leadership that the Trump administration is going to bring is really on the pro-energy side and not on the climate side. But I would just say this, for those who think that the United States under President Obama was a leader on climate policy. Our commitment under Paris, the executive actions and regulatory actions taken by the president, not by Congress. Congress has never passed any of this stuff. The actions taken by the president would get us to 55% of our Paris commitment. The biggest single piece of that are the 2 power plant rules. Those are now going to go away. They will be withdrawn. And so we are going to see that the U.S. Has a deficit from its commitment of about 2/3. So since Congress is not willing to pass significant legislation to reduce emissions and raise energy prices and limit energy use, our Paris commitment is really not worth the paper it's written on. So it really doesn't matter whether President Trump withdraws or does not withdraw, because we are not going to meet that target. So if you believe that leadership is good words and ambitious words with little action, then President Obama was a leader. If you think that actually leadership consists of taking action, then there wasn't much leadership there. So I think actually the atmospherics of the difference between Trump and Obama are radical. I think in terms of actual policy, they're not nearly as radical as the words suggest. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Myron. I think there's a few points for, a bit food for thought. I mean, I'm looking to the ex-ministers here, Have you always been telling the constituencies, what this climate change policy really entail? That was, what it really means if we're going down this very radical approach. And then this point Myron made, which I think there was people around in these circles, but also others, to what extent was the Obama pro-climate change stance sort of a feel-good factor, a feel-good thing, but one should not underestimate, in the international negotiations, of course, the atmosphere, the constructiveness and these kind of things play a role. These are international negotiations where everybody essentially has a veto now. But these are just some thoughts which, we might get into this or might not get into this. Teresa, you have prepared a few, ideas, thoughts. You've been in these negotiations from the inside, then also from the little bit in the more marginal part. So please, your comments.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Thank you for the invitation to join this panel. I will try to address the question in 2 parts: the U.S. and the climate torch, because I think that there are interesting comments to be made according to the 2 pieces of the question. First, the U.S. and the possibility that Mr. Trump coming in the White House may mean a change in the official position of the federal government, which is not irrelevant for the rest of the world. The size, the share, the relevance of this country has an impact for the climate action. But I could try to go a little bit deeper on what this could mean if this finally happens. I think this could mean a great waste of time and resources, and that's not irrelevant either for the rest of the world or for the Americans. I think that this could mean more harm, more suffer in many other places on the world, and probably also in some parts of America. It may mean a relevant impact in the American economy, in the American industry, being updated to the 21st century challenges, and it may mean more conflict in the world and in the American society. So it's not good news, and it's not indifferent for the rest of the world or for the Americans. It may also mean interesting challenges in domestic policies, because one thing is what the federal government positions is, and another thing is that the America is great. It's a big country, and there are many Americans, many constituencies, many institutional representatives of the cities, of the government, of the states that may not agree and may read the challenges of the 21st century in a different manner. So that may clash, that may create some conflicts in who does what and to what extent there is an increasing alignment of signals or different contradictory positions coming from the American society and the statements from the federal government. But still, that's something that we need to see how this evolves. I think that, Myron, when you say that there is an issue of accountability here, to me it is important also to understand that everybody is accountable, and that once we know what it is going on, and I insist on that, this is physics, this is values, this is harm, this is possibilities to deal and to lead a transition to something that we need, and to avoid being part of that transition, we are accountable to our voters, to our societies, that it is a little bit more than our voters, but we are also accountable to the rest of the world, because we are so much interdependent that at the end that's something that is relevant. Whatever we do impacts on the others. So it's not that we can forget about the context where we live in. And I think that that's more or less what it is at stake when thinking on how the American official state position may evolve in the time to come. Then I come to the torch and the international context. I think that there is not a single torch, not a single leader. The 21st century shows that we live in a very multipolar world. And this interdependence happens in parallel with different drivers, different sensitiveness, different readings on how to build our own prosperity towards the future in the years to come. And I could say that there are at least 4 big groups of countries that may share more or less the type of challenges and the type of drivers they put in place when dealing with this climate action agenda. There are the Western countries trying to figure out and to respond to all the challenges that the American society is also facing, how to transform what we've got into something different without leaving anyone behind. That's a challenge. There are the big emerging countries that have to deal in a very quick way with increasing demands of prosperity of their own societies, with limitations in terms of institutional capacity to respond to all these challenges and these huge demands from their societies. There are the middle-income countries that are at the edge of fixing what type of urban development they want to promote, what type of public services they want to promote, what type of taxation systems they want to promote, if they want cities that look like Barcelona or if they want cities that look like Atlanta, and that they will have a great impact in the decades to come. And it's a debate that it is important, and there the climate agenda is a driver to think through the development challenges in a different manner. And there are new legitimacies that are coming up that were very, very visible in Paris and in Marrakesh last year. The legitimacy of those vulnerable countries that try to do their best because they know that they are at the edge of survival or disappearance. They are ready to do as much as possible. For the rest of the world, it's important they do not fail, because that creates a terrible impact in terms of crisis, migrations, conflicts, desperation. So I think that the combination of all these different drivers with all these different legitimacies was the thing that succeeded in Paris. Everybody was trying to find why sharing the risk, sharing the learning process, sharing the opportunities to do things otherwise was much more intelligent than going each one on his own, on her own. And I guess that that's what we are going to test right now for the time being. Can it be that in the case that America official position chooses isolation, we can play the rest of the world in a different context? Is that a big part of the Americans could accept doing that way or could try to be present in the global trends through different means? I can see mayors, governors, business coming from America saying we do keep this agenda ongoing. How we can overcome this risk of wasting some energy into, difficult moments where we need to define strategy, a committed strategy to identify the obstacles, to identify the opportunities in order to scale up, to climb this huge 8,000 meters mountain we have understood is transforming our economy, our societies into a low-carbon and resilient future.
Now, we coming to Surya Sethi, who is, as I said, he has been a core negotiator in India, among many other things, but he also has an additional asset. He has been here at the Ideas Lab several times, and the first one was called Does Europe Matter? And I think we are somewhat close back to that, and maybe we haven't yet answered that in the first one. So maybe, Surya, maybe you could give us some idea how one part of the world, a bit further away, sees the European or also the global climate change situation. Please.
Thank you, Christian, and good morning. And let me begin by thanking CEPS for affording me the honor of addressing you all today. Let me highlight 4 themes which are relevant to this change of position in the US that we are seeing now. And I picked these 4 themes from what I saw was in the press during the campaign and subsequent to the campaign that Trump clearly won. So the first theme that did emerge in the campaign very strongly was that is global warming and its impact a hoax? I mean, this is behind a lot of negative vote towards this within the US. There is a belief that this is a hoax. Now, we in this forum are not competent really to answer this question. Right? But nevertheless, at least for me, it is difficult to believe that thousands of scientists spread over hundreds of independent institutions worldwide collaborated to hatch a 25-year-long conspiracy based on multiple peer-reviewed literature using cooked-up scientific data and observations from different sources and sectors to hatch the conspiracy. So this monumental hoax, including IPCC's 5 assessment reports, we are told is the handiwork of an evil climate industrial complex working to extract public funding, global prestige, and academic honors. Now, to me, that sounds a bit bizarre. Maybe true, but I'm just sharing my feeling. What I see actually on the ground is that the loss of Arctic ice and species is progressing faster than science projected. Increased variability, intensity, and frequency of climate events, receding of glaciers, sea level rise, thawing of the permafrost are all real. They are not imaginary. 16 of the 17 hottest years ever recorded have been years post-2000. And climate-linked disease and death is rising in the developing world. Now, only those showering wearing a raincoat can be oblivious to the sense of reality that surrounds us today. The second issue that I found was being debated time and again, that is USA's new position tenable? Now, one may agree or disagree with Myron, but I really respect the honesty and clarity with which he put down the reason why the US position has changed. And believe me, he's right. He's right, because the Paris Agreement, I clearly recall, the wording of the Paris Agreement was crafted so that it does not have to go to the US Senate for approval. I mean, that was the biggest weakness in my mind of the Paris Agreement. He's 100% right on that. And those surprised by President Trump's promise to renege on the Paris Accord, which USA clearly helped craft, have forgotten Kyoto completely. I mean, this is a repeat of what happened in Kyoto. However, there is a more fundamental problem that I see. And the fundamental problem is that there has been talk of abandoning the convention. Now, the convention, whether we like it or not, is a Senate-approved international treaty. And abandoning the convention is, I find, a bit problematic. The convention does not carry any enforceable legal commitments that I can hold anybody to. It nevertheless imposes several moral obligations on wealthy nations, and these moral obligations, in many subsequent COP and MOP decisions, which were all duly ratified by USA, repeatedly emphasize these moral obligations. So it's not by accident that these happen. You know, we've had 23, 24 COP MOPs, COPs and lesser MOPs, and these, whatever the convention said, those moral obligations were ratified in these COP decisions. Yeah, so those were ratified in these COP decisions. Now, abandoning the convention or defunding UN's climate programs, which both have been talked about, do carry a cost. This is not without cost. Now, loss of face being the most or perhaps the least important cost, depending on one's perspective. But there is a cost. The third issue that I want to put on the table is, what is the impact of USA abandoning the Paris Accord? From where I come in the developing world, I find the Paris Accord as a very, very weak instrument for addressing climate change and its impacts. It almost does nothing to do either. It's a miracle compared to Copenhagen, but a disaster compared to what is needed. Now, nevertheless, having said that, and I have written about this, nevertheless, it does offer the lowest common denominator for future progress, and there's hope in that. More so, since Kyoto 2 is practically dead despite Doha. So in Doha, we agreed to have a second commitment period, but nobody has ratified that. Now, the paradoxical truth is that USA enjoys unique convening powers and unparalleled diplomatic capacity to lead and craft an acceptable international climate treaty. They demonstrated this in Kyoto. They demonstrated this in Paris. This loss far outweighs the leadership gaps in mitigation, adaptation, finance, and technology under the Paris Accord. So to me, it's a major loss if the US walks out. So the fourth issue, what could China, India, and EU do? This is the message that we are talking of today. Now, I include India is not really in the same league as these, but I think India is often referred to as, people compare it with China. So I've included India so that to explain to you why India is important. Now, China and India have little in common other than being large Asian countries. That's the only common thing that we have. China accounts for about a fourth of global GHG emissions, primary energy consumption, and electricity production. India accounts for about 5% of global primary energy consumption and electricity production, and 6% of global GHG emissions. Correspondingly, China's GNI per capita is also 5 times that of India. Importantly, India's per capita electricity production and primary energy consumption are under 30% of the current global averages for the same. So less than a third of, actually it is 28 and 29%, under 30, just one. Okay. Indians. 30% of the global average levels. And Indians will not reach even current global average levels for the next 20 years. our aspirational goal for 2031-32 is to achieve 60% of the current global average. So for the next 20 years, we don't hope to achieve that. The second issue, which I think the US must take note of, is that there are 3 billion humans who live in countries with GNI below $3,000 per capita. India, home to 43% of these people, sits right in the middle with a GNI of $1,600 per capita. The world actually miraculously gets divided into two equal halves if one includes all the nations below the $4,035 per capita threshold of lower middle income countries. Exactly half are below, half are above. And India accounts for 36% of the bottom half. So India is going to suffer the worst consequences of climate change. The combined GHG emissions of this bottom half are under 20% of the current global emissions, and their historical responsibility for or the fair share burden of the bottom half of the world is only 7%. India can and should show leadership in ensuring that no country in this bottom half gets shortchanged on equity enshrined under the CBDR and RC principle of the convention. And incidentally, I repeat, that convention is ratified by the US Senate. And India cannot fill any other leadership gap under the Paris Accord. China. Now, I don't want to be impolite to my big neighbor who sits above me, but I don't believe China quite enjoys the convening power or the diplomatic capacity to fill USA's shoes, not yet at least. Neither do I see China being able to fill the other leadership gaps in mitigation, finance, and technology under the Paris Accord. Importantly, the convention squarely places the responsibility of these elements on the wealthy nations, not on China, not on India. So in conclusion, every time I've come to address the Ideas Lab, I've emphasized one thing, and that is that the EU is punching well below its weight. EU occupied the climate high table up until Copenhagen. Trump wishes to cede that high table based on the local electorate, the wish of the local electorate, so be it. The EU, in some construct of the original 6 or the current 28, must pick the ball and run with it, especially if the EU, unlike the current US regime, truly believes in consumption-led anthropogenic warming and its impacts. Thank you very much.
So, yeah. Thank you, Surya, for this view from a developing country, which has a lot of poor people. I think we have, very different views. There is some, there's a call from Enrico. He believes the European Union should really drive this agenda. Surya has given some support and said that also includes the international. And, Teresa thought there might be also some way of making bridges to the US, while Myron has presented the view about the US, this situation. It was always more skeptical about it, and now we are just a bit more honest, if I may put it like this. I don't know whether any of you want to comment on what you have heard to sharpen some of the points.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on I mentioned that the President Trump during the campaign said he would defund UN climate programs, and Surya mentioned that. I'd like to explain there are two underlying factors that need to be taken into account. The first is the Green Climate Fund was created as a result of the desperation engendered by the imminent breakdown in Copenhagen in 2009. Secretary of State Clinton flew into Copenhagen, and she was told what's needed here. The answer was money. And so this pledge of $100 billion per year from the developed countries to the developing countries was made. The U.S. share, according to the UN rating, it would be about $23.5 billion per year. cleverly, the Obama administration did not suggest that the Green Climate Fund get started until well after the Obama administration was over. And so it starts in 2020. There is no chance that the U.S. Congress is ever going to fund the Green Climate Fund. There is zero. There would have to be a revolution in the makeup of our House and Senate. So the Green Climate Fund is a dead letter as far as the United States goes. The second point is that the United States is now, it's illegal to fund the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change because of Public Law 103-236 passed in 1993 by a Democratic Congress and signed by President Clinton that says that the United States cannot fund the United Nations or any specialized agency of it that accepts as a full member any entity that lacks the internationally recognized attributes of statehood. That means Palestine. The Obama administration was clear that Palestine does not have those attributes, and yet President Obama sent some money to the Green Climate Fund, and he continued to fund the UN Framework Convention Secretariat. That has to end because it's illegal under U.S. law. So if we can't fund the UN Framework Convention, the question is, how can we belong to it? And so I get your point that withdrawing from the UN Framework Convention is a big deal, but if we're not going to pay our dues, how can we be a member of it? So Palestine was accepted as a member in March of 2016 as a full member, understanding that this was U.S. law. Why did the United Nations do that? Well, because they thought they could get away with it, that no administration in the U.S. would ever actually enforce the law. The Trump administration says it's going to. I think right now I'd take that very seriously.
Teresa?
Thank you, Christian. I think that when we get into these debates, it is important to bear in mind the basics, because otherwise we get trapped in the micromanagement of the questions. I don't think that most of the constitutions of the world that were written before 1990 consider climate change as a main driver for their action. So I think that there are many domestic realities that need to be improved in order to respond to the challenges that we already know exist. So my first bold question is, do we accept what the science, the physics, the chemistry show us, the risk of a big collapse? So a race against time in order to avoid this collapse happening. If we accept this very basic question, then we need to reorganize our way of thinking in a very different manner. And it has taken decades to reorganize our way of thinking, accepting that it is much better to do together and to share risk, lessons, and learning process than going alone. But the third question is the comments made by Myron on the Green Climate Fund and Mrs. Clinton and the amount. In fact, there are two things that could look contradictory, but both are true and important. The 100 billion is a small piece of what we need, of what we want, and it is not just public funding. It is how to combine things in order to have this leverage to transform the signals in order to ensure that we do not waste money and that we facilitate the type of investments we need in order to shift, to change the type of infrastructures, of support or solidarity that we need to put in place to face the climate challenges. And then the second part, 100 billion per year is peanuts. What we really need is coherent investment decisions everywhere. We cannot accept the risk of wasting big amounts of money and getting trapped in something that may drive us into a big collapse. And my final point on this issue is that, of course, I hope that the official position of the U.S. is to keep to stay being part of this discussion with all the contradictions, all the difficulties, but being a partner of these global challenges being driven through cooperation and not through conflict. But the most dangerous thing I've seen up to now has been the signature of this executive order deleting the transparency on the financial system. Because what we need to showcase, what we need to learn, is what are those risks that we have not taken into consideration up to now that may bring us into a much more difficult situation. So coming back to the obscure times, taking into consideration the share of the American financial system in the global system is a bomb. That's what, in my views, is the most dangerous thing we have seen up to now.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Enrico and then Surya, and then we open for questions.
First of all, let me underline what Teresa just said. A few weeks ago, The Guardian published an article that takes the post-truth politics discussion one step further, which is a post-statistics society. Because if facts don't matter, then the basis of the Enlightenment, if you wish, it's at risk. I'm not saying that this is happening in the US, I'm not saying that. But it's saying, what I want to underline is that if we have thousands of scientists that work on these and are paid also by public funds, and we say, well, we don't trust them, whoever says that, I think that puts another brick to this story that is very dangerous. The second point is why Europe should carry the torch. In the Italian debate, Limes, who is a very well-known Institute for Public Affairs and International Affairs, has a nice chart of Europe and the world, and showing that we are living close to chaos land, because climate change will hit so dramatically the tropical area and the equator and so on, and we are very close to that. And what we are seeing already is this mass migration, which has a very important climate-related origin. So I think that this is an additional reason why Europe should do even more than what has been planned so far. And then finally, a very personal comment. And this is related to the Italian situation. We saw through the American elections, but also what's going on in Europe and other, that people can change quite radically their views. And this has an impact on policies and politics. Well, in Italy we have something like 55,000 people dead because of pollution-related diseases. And climate change is going to change this, increasing this number. Now, this is not perceived by the public opinion as politicians' fault, but it is. And in fact, the European Union is going to impose on Italy 1 billion euros penalty because we are not just simply applying the law in terms of anti-pollution rules. So my impression is that people will have an increasing interest and attention to these kind of things, and will see much more than in the past politicians accountable and responsible for what is going to be really a dramatic situation. So my point is that if we want to learn from what is going on, and also of the tensions we are living in Italy and the neighbor countries, we have to take this very seriously, but being coherent. I agree with you that just making nice announcements and not doing the right thing is not going to make us better. Maybe we look better, but we are not.
Surya.
Just two quick rejoinders, one, I've lived 20 years in the US in my life, so I have great regard for the institutions in that country. And to me personally, when I look at the US debate today, I see them as a test for the local institutions. And I'm looking forward to what actually happens, because it's a great test, I think. There's lots of things will be tested. But let me ask a very specific question to Myron, and please correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding of the situation is that this Palestinian issue is 2015 or 2016. Is that correct?
Palestine was accepted as a
Yes.
full member, and its membership took effect in March 17 of 2016.
That's correct. So March 2016. Now the convention was signed and approved by the Senate in 1995. Now the 92. Okay. So now, so the issue is that it precedes that date by far. Now, why would you want to use this Palestinian issue to renege on a commitment that was agreed to by the Senate? I find that a little difficult to accept. You should resolve the Palestinian issue. I have no problems with that. And find the best resolution for that. But you can't use something that some administration did in 2000, at least as a common law principle, it tells me. I'm not a lawyer, but it tells me that something some administration did in 2016 cannot undo what the Senate approved in 1992. So that rankles me a little bit. So that's one. The second issue, which also, your previous speeches and others have raised, and I want to leave this thought behind, because we've talked of sustainability, and I've been here 2 days and looked at many of the forums that we were talking in. One of the issues that Myron makes is that the Trump era is going to be an energy, for energy era. More energy, the better. And there's some truth in it, because nobody has developed in this world without consuming more energy. But the reality of the situation is, when I listen to the debates here since yesterday, everybody talks of the supply-sided issues on energy. Nobody raised the consumption side of the equation at all. That I find, again, very disturbing coming from where I come. There is any amount of data available that an average consumption of about 2.5 tons per capita of oil equivalent delivers you a human development index of about 0.0 to 0.85. Now, most in the developing world from where I come would be happy with half that amount. But yet, the top 15% of this world, on average, is consuming 6.5 tons, and the range is from 3 tons to 12 tons. Now, I find that difficult to accept. That, look, is that I have no space? I mean, as I've often said in one of the UNSC sessions, said that, look, my life is not worth living anyway. So just show me the ocean you want me to jump into, and the bottom half will jump into that ocean, so that the top half will be safe. But at least still, the top half has to reduce their emissions by 80%. So before I die, show me how you're going to do that. So at least give me the pleasure of dying, that, look, I have saved you because you have a plan for the other 80%. So I think we need to be realistic about this, and not just because an electorate may not understand the intricacies of climate change, use that electoral victory to undo a international agreement. As I said, we can differ on this, but I find it a little difficult to accept. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Myron, if you allow me to give you a chance later on, we would like, people have been very patient, so I would like to ask, who would like to make a comment. There is one here. Is there a microphone? And that there is one here. And who else wants to? There is one, 3, and then we'll see how far we get. Please ask questions and not longer statements. I would appeal to you, please, and identify yourselves.
I'm Nicholas. Can you hear this?
Yes.
I'm Nicholas Ashford from MIT. Just a question for Mr. Ebel. Okay, Trump was elected by the Electoral College by 50% of the people who voted, around 25% of the population, but of course not the popular vote, which overwhelmingly supports climate action. So here's the question. By what justification, and I'd like to hear it, does the Trump administration justify ignoring popular will and the extent to which it basically caters to private interests of industry to sell energy, to produce energy, all exposing an incredible arrogance of power arrogance of power which will not enhance the reputation of the United States. I think Europe should take the mantle, but I would like to know how Mr. Ebel can justify, this is not a mandate to destroy climate change. It is not a mandate of that any kind. So what will you tell your grandchildren? I'd like to hear it.
Okay, thank you. Stefan, please, as concrete question as possible.
As usual. Thanks. Stefan Singer. I'm working with Climate Action International. We are representing 1,200 NGOs worldwide, working on climate, clean energy, equity, sustainability, and like, and of course we're also in the US. I think the question for us is, should we accept that the US is leaving in one way or the other? Should we try to stop it, to delay it? I would say we have to accept it. Can we do better without the US in the Paris Accords? I would say probably we can, because as people have said correctly, and you said it, our Indian colleague, the Paris Accords were struck with a strong advice by the US and saying everything you put in the text, which even remotely links to legally binding whatever, will be killed by Congress. So the rest of the world caved in. We became the slaves of a couple of Congress folks and created, to appease the US, to have the US on board. China accepted this as well. Now, if the US is out, my theory would be, if not only Europe, I'm sorry to say, developing countries like India, China, and the climate vulnerable countries come together, the Paris Accord might be strengthened in terms of better agreements, in terms of binding agreements, and get rid of some of the pledge and review thing, which we have in there. My question would be then, how do we deal then with the US and giving them a space, because my feeling is Trump in 4 years might be very likely history, unless he is impeached because of his erratic behavior elsewhere. Let's leave the door open for the US to return. Let's keep them out in the Paris Accords. Let's get a better deal. Let's improve the targets, which is part of the Paris Accords for 2020, reviewing the NDCs, and then reserve a space for the US once they have a more rational leadership in the White House later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There was a third one, and I don't know whether there are other comments to be made. Yes, one here, because my feeling is, after this round, we might not have time for another round. We have to stop at 12:30 sharp.
Well, my name is Alexander Kovacevic. Just two very direct, short questions. Yesterday morning, European Union offered to facilitate state aid to lignite-fired power plants in Serbia to actually add flue gas desulfurization and to extend their life for decades and basically increase CO2 emissions. Is it the same EU, what you've been talking about? That's the first question. And the second, assuming that there is increase in gas production in US as a consequence of opening new and additional resources, etc., it obviously means more export, and it possibly means an attempt to increase the market share in Europe. Is it going to be accompanied with political, military, and institutional might as other competitors are using at European market? Okay, thank you. Alexander is among other at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, but he has other functions as well. Okay. Then sorry, you're on hold. Myron wants to answer, or the others seem to want to answer that as well.
Professor Ashford asked me a question directly. I'll answer that, and then the other two questions I'll let my colleagues answer. It seems to me that the arrogance is in the ambitions of the left in the United States and the Obama administration in particular to create an administrative structure that forces the United States to use different kinds of energy at higher prices without the consent of the Congress. The Congress is the preeminent branch of government. It's Article 1 of the Constitution. It makes the laws. And yet we now have an administrative state that started around a century ago that has become a monster. And part of that monster is called the Environmental Protection Agency. Steve Bannon spoke at a major conservative conference in Washington yesterday, and he said that it is the goal of the Trump administration to deconstruct the administrative state as far as possible. That is not arrogance, that is humility. That is actually putting the people back in charge of their own government and not a bunch of bureaucrats.
Okay, thank you. I would suggest we are closing this intra-US discussion at that point and moving back to the subject. Please, Jacques, and then we are taking there were a number of questions to address them.
Jacques de Jong, Klingendahl Energy from the Netherlands. Energy. Fortunately, the US does not have a federal energy policy. And this was a misgiving in the past. But fortunately, you don't have a national, an integrated federal energy policy. And especially in all the context of decarbonization. That's left to the states. That's left to the states. So, and the other thing is the US believes in markets. You believe in markets. Yeah, and if you are saying that you want to expand oil and gas production and exports, what about the markets? What about the markets? We know in Europe.
Where are the markets?
We know in Europe that Russian pipeline gas always will compete downwards US LNG exports. So what about the markets? So keep on dreaming.
Okay, here we had a couple of points. The EU should, trying to get a coalition, but keeping the space open. There were some questions from Alexander and saying, are the Europeans as green as they pretend? And I think the last one, there are markets and there are market situation, and actually what we have in Europe, we have plenty of everything. We have far too much electricity, we have lots of gas and coal and other things. So do we need high price? Should it be high price? LNG is not cheap in Europe. Many questions. Maybe we have some answers. Who wants to start that? Teresa.
So I read 3 questions in the room. Is the EU as green as it pretends? It is probably one of the greenest places. It is not green enough, just to be very bold. And I think that we need to face a phased-out strategy together with a phase-in strategy, which is not easy, and that's what we are trying to do. And I think that clarity, transparency on this issue of public subsidies to fossil fuel things, and a clear agenda on how we get rid of all of that. Probably it's not from day to the next one, but we need to fix and to agree on what is the right term and be clear on how to do that is pretty important. Starting with coal, then oil, then what is the role for gas in 30 years' time, and to what extent it makes sense to make big investments in something that it may last 30 years. So I think that that's something to be discussed. That's the first comment. The second question was on what about the US leaving the multilateral context and so on, and if this is good or bad. I think it could be bad news, very honestly, very bad news. I don't want to have North Korea's the size of America doing its own war internally because they read wrongly at the federal level. Sorry, Myron, I don't want to be unpolite, but I mean, the very same example, the very same words you used to respond, the professor, I could do the other way wrong. I think it is pretty arrogant to pretend to impose something that goes against history, the interests of the American society, and the interests of the whole humankind. And I think that we, the rest of the world, need to stand very clear on that. In 15 days, the first 15 days of the Trump administration has been a permanent challenge to the UN chart. And I think that's not admissible. I wonder what it could have happened if it could have been someone coming from a Middle East country doing these type of things. I think that that's something we need to look in a very deeply way, and I think that that's very important in terms of what we could call North-North principles, cooperation since the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the human rights and the understanding of what peace means for the whole world, and that's what it concerns to me, and this is why I think it is very impressive and very sad also, very impressive in the good way, very sad in the bad way. How the American society is reacting. So, Jack, you are wrong, and you are right, sorry, and this is what I wanted to stress. I think that if you leave the space that could be naturally accepted in terms of leadership for the federal government, there will be others coping that space internally, and there will be others coping that space in the international arena. So it's a pity to have such a big isolated country on its own because some reading of the reality that does not match the 21st century reality. We cannot avoid the deep interdependence of the humankind in a very small world like the one we live in. So I think it is much more intelligent to drive to be part of that discussion, and I am very sorry. It could be a very bad news, very, very bad news, that the American government leaves the UN system, and in very concrete terms, the UN climate cooperation. That, well, for many reasons, legal, political reasons, is something that needs to be developed. And it could be a very bad signal, because at the end, still, this is a game of confidence. We were talking about that before. But people wonder how in hell we are going to do that this is inevitable. So, having some saying, well, it may be inevitable, but I don't care, undermines the confidence on the capacity to do it. And that's bad news, very bad news. And there was a third question, but I don't remember, so I stopped.
So, yeah, Surya.
On the gentleman's question about leaving America out, I completely agree. I don't think, and I'll illustrate this with a very simple anecdote. In India, we have 1,242 political parties. Every time you disagree with somebody in the party, you go and build another party. Now, unfortunately, international diplomacy is about carrying people with you rather than leaving them on the wayside if there is disagreement. So I'm sorry, but I disagree with that. And as I said, I don't think any other country enjoys the convening power that America has. So one way or the other, it's better to deal with that upfront and solve the issue rather than leave them aside for a few years and hope Trump will go away. Maybe Trump too will emerge. Who knows? So I don't think that's a good enough solution. Sorry.
If I may, the Paris agreements were part of a broader agreement in principle, which is called Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, you don't find any particular target in the targets agreed in September 2015 because this was delegated to the Paris Agreement. Now, I don't think that Trump has decided to get out of the SDGs simply because that is not relevant, but maybe you can explain to me, because in the US, let's say, world, but also in the European world and many other worlds, those goals, those targets were not yet taken very seriously so far. My point is that agreement, I'm talking about the goals and the targets, was for the first time ever a general agreement on what we would like to achieve all together. So getting out of one of the pieces, and this is my question, does it mean that US doesn't recognize all the others, or is there is a contradiction? This is my question to you, if I may.
Well, I don't know that I have an answer to that, except to say that there has been a rumor that the White House wants to review all multilateral treaties and all our participation in all UN agencies, with an idea to eliminating ones that they think are unnecessary or unhelpful. I don't know whether that rumor is true, and I don't know where that will go. I would say, if I could pick up on something Teresa said earlier, and that was brought up, yes, about our lack of a national environmental policy. It is the case that the goal of the Obama administration was to create a national energy policy that would force the heartland states to adopt the policies of California, New York, and New England. That has now failed. So we are back to having no national energy policy. That means, of course, that California, New York, and New England are perfectly capable of belonging to the UN Framework Convention if they want to, participating in the COPs, whatever they like. But I would point out to you that these states have essentially adopted policies that outsource all of their energy-intensive goods to the heartland states and to China, so that California no longer has a manufacturing base. It no longer it used to have a huge amount of energy-intensive industries. All those are gone now, but they still buy energy-intensive goods. So these economies are actually parasitical upon the economy, for example, of Indiana, Ohio, Oklahoma, and Texas. So good luck with having California as a full member of the Paris Agreement.
Okay, thank you. In looking to the watch, I think it's time to bring this to a close. The sessions resume at 12:30. So let us close here. Quite expectedly. We did not agree on all the points, but there was some agreement. But I think the 3 points I take home is there is still a lot of uncertainty how this all plays out, and I guess we will have to live with this, and we will see much more a bit later. From on back, all. Yeah. Okay, the uncertainty is on what is going to happen in the US. That was my reference. We all seem to take assumptions, and but the decisions are still pending or being forthcoming. So the second is there seems to be a need or a potential for a stronger EU role. I don't want to use leadership. Maybe it develops into something like this. But also then the third point, our friend Surya Sethi, who's been here so many times, has some doubts of whether the EU and even with the rest of the world is able to, play the role with the unique of the US with the unique convening power and also the diplomatic skills. Now that I think is a challenge for the Europeans, or a question for the Europeans to think about this ourselves. Now with this, let me thank all the four panelists for what I thought is a very interesting, fascinating debate of something which will continue for a long time. I would like to especially thank the two people from overseas, as we sometimes call it, taking the time and the bother to come here to CEPS and discussing this issue, Surya and Myron. But of course, also all our other friends, have been here. Thank you very much. And I hope you have found the discussion interesting. So let me thank the speakers with a big applause. Thank you.